Well, I just don't know how anybody at this point can give any credibility to the denial. Yesterday, when the White House had every opportunity to deny the report, and they were given the information straight up, they refused to deny it. And in fact, Fox News confirmed it, that the president had said this. So this morning he comes back and says he didn't say it. It just seems to me to compound the error that was made. And it's a very troubling one. I think everybody, liberal or conservative, is resistant to come to any conclusion about the president or try to, we don't need additional static. But when he says things...
need additional stuff. That's
well,
so true.
It's not, it's so much. Remember, the start of this week, Melissa, we were arguing about whether or not he was fit and mentally competent to serve as president. Then he put the meeting on television to demonstrate. And now at the end of the week, we're arguing about, my God, what did he say? And how can he say that about human beings? The country may be in bad shape, but we as Americans have always taken in people who seek to fulfill their dreams and their children's dreams in this country of opportunity. And here he is calling those people, not the country, by that vulgar term.
Rachel?
Well, first of all, my understanding of it was he was talking about the countries, those governments being not so great. First of all, I don't agree with this term. I'm glad Mia Love put that out, and I would too. Sometimes the best immigrants come from those kind of countries. They're better able to see the difference between what we're offering opportunity-wise versus those countries that are often corrupt and are dysfunctional. That said, I still have a problem with people in a private meeting going out and saying what the president said when they know, like right now, I just heard a report that said the Panamanian ambassador just quit over this. It makes our country look bad. I think the Democrats in this case should have used some discretion. And even if he did say that, maybe for the sake of the country,
can I ask you a question, though?
Not repeat it.
And I understand what you're saying about the Democrats repeating this. There were Republicans in that room. We have confirmed that.
Yeah, I know.
Senators Graham, Flake, Cotton.
I know, but
so for them, let me finish. On a day in which the president just signed a proclamation honoring Dr. King, which was a beautiful moment.
Yeah.
On a day that he does that at the White House, it is complicated. It is a point of conflict, if you will, in your mind to try to hold both these thoughts. And that's simply, if these men were there, and we know it's already leaked out and people are talking about it, where are their voices to either defend this
They're not defending, which means he probably said it.
Or say he said it and this was the context and adding their context to it. Where are those Republican voices?
The fact that the Republicans that were in the room are not coming to his defense tells me that he probably said it. But here's what I just want to say one thing. Again, I'm not defending the comments, but this is a 70-year-old man. He speaks in a certain way. It's very impolitic. It's very un-PC. And, who among us hasn't said an un-PC thing? I get it. I don't approve of it. But I don't understand why, for the sake of politics, you would, in a private meeting, go out and say
all right, I want to jump in with this, though, because apparently the Panamanian ambassador actually resigned 24 hours before these comments were made.
Okay.
Brett Baer has confirmed that for us. Thank you, Brett, first of all, for watching and also for getting in on the conversation with the facts. The first diplomat to resign, he said it happened. It's John Freely is his name, and so I just wanted to get that out there.
I want to address something that Juan said. First of all, I do think this has been the longest week of any of our lives. My goodness. The whole week has been pretty much insane. I would answer his question, which is the reason why we want people from places that are a disaster is that these are the immigrants so often that appreciate being here the most and work the hardest once they're here and really understand the difference. And even as we take this conversation forward, and even if you try to advance it to, is this the labor that we want coming into this country if the system is falling apart and people are perhaps less skilled and less educated? And I would say, talk to people that run businesses and say that when you have an immigrant worker, they want immigration to be legal because these are the people who value these jobs and work very hard versus teenagers, oftentimes who don't appreciate the minimum wage job. I think in addition, the language is horrible, whether it's said or not, but the sentiment also needs to be corrected.
All right, I want to go to this. Reporters after MLK Day dedication. Can we take a peek at that? Maybe not.
Mr. President, will you give an apology for the statement yesterday? Mr. President, did you refer to African Asians? You sort of shitholed
Mr. President, are you a racist? Mr. President, will you respond to these serious questions about your statement, sir?
No, Mr. President,
I'm talking to the President, not you, sir. Mr. President, are you a racist?
Katie, you and I have been in scrums like that on different occasions, and, you know, people shout all sorts of things out, and they're wild microphones, and you could hear much of what they were saying at and to the president.
Yeah, the questions of, are you a racist? Did you say the word that we're not going to say here on the air?
Yeah.
The thing for me is there is a distinction between the people who live in a country and the governments that run it. Yahoo News interviewed a 30-year-old sociologist from Guinea, and she actually agrees with the president and ran through a whole long list of African countries that are corrupt in the way that they treat women and the societies that they run there. That being said, the president has to realize that these kinds of comments detract away from what he's trying to get done. Earlier this week, he had a phenomenal meeting with bipartisan support for the first time in a year since he got inaugurated in January. They were praising him publicly on microphones outside the White House to the media.
Yeah.
And here we are now just pulling all of that back as if it didn't happen. And so he has to realize that, yes, he says things in a very candid way. Some of it might be true, some might not be true, but it does serve as a distraction to his agenda and what his goals are.
Well, and I don't know how genuine, Juan, to further Katie's point, Democrats were when they said, oh, we could be close to getting a deal. I don't know how many of them would have eventually jumped on board. But this is a distraction. And, you know, I would question, and I hear you on private. I did not hear anybody say off the record, but I hear you on a private meeting. Right. The complicating fact for me in that meeting is how lowbrow were the arguments such that these words were needed to make the argument?
Well, let's go back, because what the reporting indicates is that they were having a conversation about this lottery, this diversity lottery.
The visa lottery.
And so what happens in that lottery, Harris, is that the U.S. government has determined that there are certain countries that are underrepresented in terms of the immigrant flow into the United States, legal immigrant flow. And in order to make sure that people from these less represented countries had an opportunity, they then started this lottery program. Mm-hmm. At that point, President Trump was saying he wants to cut that program. He really wants to eliminate, I think, but he says he's willing to cut it in half. And they were talking about, okay, if we're going to cut it in half, let's make sure that we have a special program to make sure that people from distressed countries, and here they were talking about African, Haitian, El Salvador.
Mostly countries of people of color.
Yes, and the president then apparently responded with this vulgarity, saying, why do we need people from those blank countries? Again, speaking to what Melissa pointed out, there's a difference between the countries and corrupt government. That was Katie's point.
Actually, Katie said that.
No, and Melissa said we need to speak to the spirit of the comment, which is, gosh.
Answer the question that he had.
Yeah, because it should be, it should be so obvious. You know what, Mr. President, your family immigrated to this country. At that time, people spoke in those negative terms about,
that's true,
you know, other parts of the world. And now you talk about this and the heavy load of the racial part, people from those countries being people of color, unlike people from Norway.
Indentured servants from Ireland.
Right. That's right.
Yes.
And who first went through the Caribbean, Barbados, where I was just a few weeks ago. The community, the Irish community, very proud, but they came as indentured servants and settled there. And some came to the upper northeast part of this country as well. And where would we be if we didn't have these immigrants?
I wouldn't be here. My family is of Irish descent.
And my husband's of Irish descent. And people who are from Ireland, just look out here on St. Patrick's Day, whose parents came, they're still very proud. So you can understand why Mia Love and other people felt very offended by the comment he made. That said, I still don't in my heart believe the president's a racist. I think he's just an old guy who says things in a very impolitic way. And I think that sometimes not being a politician has benefited him. This would have been a day where being a politician would have benefited him, because I think he says things in ways that just give more grist to the mill for his...
But does it affect the policy?
It does, and I just talked to my husband about this, and
we had a great conversation. Can we share a little bit of that green room conversation?
Yeah, and Sean said, look, we were in a better place at the beginning of the week to get a deal.
Right.
2 days ago you were in a better place.
That's the real point.
Than we are right now. And I'll tell you what, this is now being fought on the terms that the Democrats like, which is identity politics and the racialization of immigration and border security.
Wait a second. Who brought identity politics into this, Rachel? I think it was the president, not the Democrats.
I would argue the Democrats who walked out of that room and decided to repeat those words that were said. Those incendiary remarks.
Why did he say it then?
And Democrats
I'm not saying we're not just of the comment, you're asking
All right,
the origin of the politics. An origin of the politics, to me, happens when you leave a private meeting and you don't share a transcript, which is very different than sharing just certain comments and remarks. The origin of the remarks, the president. The origin of the politics, the Democrats.
Agreed.
So then I ask the question again, because nobody answered. I'll go to you with it. What is incumbent upon the Republicans in that room to do at this point? Anything?
I don't know. I mean, I almost think that you have to come. I think you have to be honest about what you think you heard and what you heard.
You do.
I do. I mean, we can't be in a place where we're lying about anything. I mean, we've got to come forward, talk about what happened, talk about how to fix it. I mean, like I said, answer the actual question of why it is valuable to have people from these countries.
Right.
Because they make this a country. They appreciate being here. They work really hard. This is what our country is all about, taking people who are in horrible circumstances and giving them and their families the chance for something better. I think underneath that point is this idea that it is difficult to get people immigrating from a country that has a failed government, and he's maybe confusing those topics where it's tough to vet people in terms of terror, but that's not what Haiti is about.
So when I say I agree with you as a journalist, I'm in favor of more words, not fewer. So bringing forth whatever we know now that everything is leaked is helpful to maybe get us to that next point of talking. I mean, look at the kind of conversation you can have, and maybe they can get back to the point where they can do a deal. I don't know. January 19th, though, government spending deadline, and this will be part of that conversation, no doubt.